Okay, so I'm just going to kind of hit the high points today, and then if we need to jump in the system, we can do that after the presentation. So we're just going to hit on some of the key differences. There's not all that many. I know it seems like it's really different, but a lot of it's just reorganization. So we're going to step through some of the big differences between WFDS Classic and WFDS Next Gen today. So planning area. The first difference is that WFDS Next Gen, when you start a decision, automatically generates a planning area for you. And the intent there is to be able to get you a spatial inventory right off the bat and some analytics related to that spatial inventory. And here over the next year, we're also going to be working to try and get some automated analyses in there. As we add in the models, we're going to try and automate those too. But one of the first automated models will be FS Pro. And we'll use that planning area as your default landscape. So that's the other reason for the automatically generated planning area. When we generate that spatial inventory, the other thing that it does is it creates a lot of incident shapes tied to your Spatial Fire Planning Service shapes. Basically, it clips them. So if you had subunit objective shapes like strategic objective shapes or management requirements or other unit shapes, we're going to clip those, and then they'll be available in drop downs in the strategic assessment section and the course of action section. So I'll show that. And if you don't like that automated planning area, even right off the bat, you can always draw your own. You can upload it. Or you could copy a shape like a pod or one of your strategic objective shapes or multi-unit shapes and use that as your planning area as well. So the first part is the strategic assessment section, which is actually where your objectives and requirements are. We did expand this section a little bit by adding in categories. So I'm going to go through how we've enhanced this section. So in WFDS Classic, your objectives were composed of your strategic objectives and your management requirements, which were coming in from the spatial fire planning. And that spatial fire planning data was inside WFDS. So that would get clipped by your planning area, and it would show you what's in your planning area in that objectives tab. That data was managed by your data managers and then by the RD&A, depending on if it was language or shapes. And we had a couple updates a year, I think, but really it was one main one pre-season meant to get all your spatial fire planning stuff updated. And then you have the user created incident objectives and incident requirements. And those are created in addition to your strategic objectives and management requirements. So that's one key difference between Classic and Next Gen. And then they could be associated with a shape. So you could draw a shape for an incident objective or an incident requirement. The way it's working in WFDS Next Gen is we've moved all the spatial fire planning to a service. So your spatial fire planning data still gets clipped by your planning area. The difference is all that data is coming in from the Spatial Fire Planning Service. So it's managed by the local unit. You can update it whenever if you want. So if you need to add something in or change something for a decision, technically you could do that and then refresh your planning area, reclip it, and it would get pulled into the decision. I might show this in a few minutes, but this all gets pulled into the decision, but it gets pulled into the list in spatial or strategic assessment as well. So your incident objectives and incident requirements are actually tiered to those. So you can build an objective on top of your strategic objective or on top of your management requirement. And that way you can show how your incident is tiered to your land and resource management plan directly by tying those two things together. And if those don't apply in the context of the current situation, you don't have to do that. You can just tie them to the planning area. But they are explicitly spatial in WFDS NextGen. So they do have to be tied to a shape. Like I said, the default should be just your planning area. And then I will just mention there's a bunch of new classes of shapes. So we have the subunit overlapping shapes, which would be equivalent to your old management requirements. The other unit shapes is coming in now in a service, I believe. Is that correct, Jonah? I think we got that pushed through.
Yep, they'll be coming to EDU soon.
Okay. And then we have the subunit non-overlapping shapes, which is more strategic objectives, subunit overlapping shapes, management requirements, unit boundary shapes, and then multi-unit shapes. The other big difference is that we allow categorization of these objectives and requirements. So you can still use your old categories of objectives and requirements, and you can just stick to those if you want. There's also protection objectives, and there's some more nuanced ones for other objectives like safety concerns and things that are tied directly to your relative risk elements specifically, and some of your organization assessment elements as well. So you can put a little bit more nuance in your objectives and requirements. And the other big thing is that we've incorporated ISAP as an option for your strategic assessments. So if you have a particular value that you really want to highlight in your decision, you can click critical value at risk, and then you can go through the ISAP process of rating the risk of that value. Totally optional, you don't have to do it, but gives you another tool. Don't see any questions, so I'm going to go to the next section. Next section is the strategic course of action. This is all under the strategy stepper here on the top, and strategic course of action is your next step over to the right. Okay, so in WFDS Classic, you could have several different courses of action, but it's implied to be tied to your planning area. They weren't explicitly tied to shapes, other than your planning area. And then we had the strategy slider to help you describe your suppression strategy. And then we were using MAPs in combination with that course of action to give a little bit more nuance inside the planning area to your course of action. And what's been done in WFDS NextGen is you can still have one or several courses of action, but they're explicitly tied to the planning area. So you have to pick a shape to tie it to. By default, you can make that the planning area. You could make it a pod. You could make it one of your spatial fire planning shapes, or you could just draw a shape to apply a course of action to. Because you're explicitly tying it to a shape, we determined we don't really need MAPs on the strategy part. And so now MAPs are going to be associated with the ISAP process. So they're more tactical tool. And your course of action can be an MAP in and of itself. So if the fire leaves a particular area, you actually change your strategy or your course of action, or both. And the other big thing was we turned the suppression strategy into a drop-down, and those match the NWCG strategies. And you do have the option to report those to Irwin if you choose to. If you don't have to. So instead of the slider that was kind of squishy, made things a little bit difficult with the management direction alignment table and tying your WFDS decision to your 209, now you can be very explicit so that you're in line with what's going into your 209. On the 209, one thing I will mention, if you do decide you're going to report your strategy to Irwin, In the future, 209 has expressed interest in reading that value from WFDS. So WFDS would be the system of record. If you do not report it, then you would have to enter those strategies directly into the 209. And to be clear, the 209 won't be reading that at the beginning of this fire season, but that they have expressed interest in doing that in the near future. The other thing with your course of action is you can only have one course of action in a particular point on the landscape. So the list that you have for your course of action does matter. If there's any fire behavior analysts on the call, it's very similar to how your landscape rules would be applied. So top to bottom, the one on top stays on top, and that's your course of action for that particular place. If there's a shape or a course of action underneath it that kind of bleeds into that top course of action, the one on top wins. And then we take all those courses of action and we break it down into a strategic summary for you. So you have a breakdown of all the different strategies that are inside your planning area, where your fire perimeter overlaps them, and if you have any spots inside your planning area that aren't defined. So if you're doing a really complicated decision with a bunch of different courses of action, that'll help indicate whether you have parts of your planning area that are undefined as far as the strategy goes. So as I mentioned, the MAPs are now moved over into the ISAP process. And we're hoping that's going to cut down on the confusion between WFDS and ISAP and which MAPs are which, trying to number those and keeping those in sync. So now the MAPs will just be in the ISAP process. Last tab in strategy is the cost tab. And just a few minor differences here, depending how you define minor, but no more SCI. SCI is being retired. And the only other thing in here is that we added the ISAP cost estimation spreadsheet as another tool you can download. And then it won't be live in version 1, but fairly soon we're hoping to read the Irwin estimated cost to date and provide it to you here as a reference on the cost tab. Okay, that was a quick overview. Last thing, we will be reworking the objectives project a little bit. So Sarah, can you put that in the chat so people have that to refer to?
Yep. And also just to bring people's awareness, Wes did add the spatial fire planning shaped type diagram into the chat as well.
Awesome. That's all I had to share. Are there questions